Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones hidden by those who claim to love us most. For 23 years, everyone in Cedar Ridge believed that Evelyn Brennan was born blind, a family tragedy that even wealth and power couldn't prevent. But when Austin Blackwood, a weathered mountain man, returns to town after decades away, he sees what others have missed. The way she turns toward distant sounds, how her fingers trace light patterns, how her blindness doesn't follow nature's rules. Austin notices that something isn't right about the rich man's daughter. The powerful Brennan family has built their reputation on strength and honor. But what if their greatest tragedy was actually their greatest lie? What secret could be so dark that they've hidden the truth from their own daughter for over 2 decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge as Austin Blackwood guided his weathered horse toward the hitching post outside Hartman's General Store. 20 years had passed since he'd last seen this town, yet the weathered buildings and familiar faces stirring to life brought back memories he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. His leather journal, worn smooth by countless mountain nights, rested securely in his saddlebag, a repository of observations and sketches that had become his companion during the solitary years. Austin had learned to notice details that others missed. In the mountains, survival depended on reading the subtle signs that nature provided. The way shadows fell differently before a storm, how animals behaved when predators were near, the almost imperceptible changes that meant the difference between life and death. These skills had kept him alive through harsh winters and dangerous encounters, but he never expected to need them in a quiet frontier town. Cedar Ridge had grown since his departure. New buildings lined the main thoroughfare, and the railroad depot buzzed with activity that spoke of prosperity and progress. Yet beneath the surface of advancement, Austin sensed an undercurrent of something else, a tension that seemed to permeate the very air, like the scent of rain before a thunderstorm. The Brennan family name appeared everywhere: Brennan Bank, Brennan Cattle Company, Brennan Feed and Supply. Their influence had clearly expanded during Austin's absence, transforming them from successful ranchers into the undisputed power brokers of the territory. Their sprawling ranch house, visible even from town, sat like a fortress on the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, its imposing presence a constant reminder of wealth and authority. Austin had returned to settle a debt not of money, but of conscience. Old Pete Morrison, the man who'd given him his first job breaking horses, had died the previous winter. Pete's letter, delivered by a traveling preacher, had reached Austin in his mountain cabin with a simple request: ensure that Pete's final wishes were carried out and his few possessions given to the right people. It was the kind of obligation that couldn't be ignored, the sort of promise that defined a man's character. As Austin dismounted and secured his horse, the general store's bell chimed softly. The door opened, and a young woman emerged, moving with careful, measured steps. Her hand traced the wooden rail of the porch with practiced precision, and her head tilted slightly as she listened to the sounds around her. This, Austin realized, must be Evelyn Brennan. She was perhaps 23 years old, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and a face that spoke of gentle strength. Her dress was simple but well made, and she carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with the cautious way she navigated the world. What struck Austin immediately was not her blindness, but something else entirely, something that didn't quite align with what he knew about those who had never seen. "Careful there, miss," Austin said softly as she approached the steps. "There's a loose board about 3 steps down." Evelyn paused, her head turning toward his voice with an expression of mild surprise. "Thank you for the warning. You must be new to town. I don't recognize your voice." "Austin Blackwood. I used to live here many years ago. And you're Miss Brennan, if I'm not mistaken." A slight smile crossed her features. "Evelyn, please." And you're right, it has been many years since anyone warned me about that particular step. Most folks in town know I've memorized every loose board and uneven stone in Cedar Ridge. Austin studied her face as she spoke, noting details that others might miss. Her eyes, though unfocused, moved in response to sounds in ways that seemed almost too precise. When a bird called from the oak tree beside the store, her gaze shifted toward it with an accuracy that made him pause. When the store's cat knocked over a small pot on the porch, she turned toward the sound before it had fully registered with Austin himself. "You've lived here all your life, then?" Austin asked, genuinely curious. "Born and raised on the ranch," Evelyn replied. "Though I don't get to town as often as I'd like. Father worries about me navigating the streets alone, so I usually have an escort." She gestured toward a man who had emerged from the store behind her, a tall, stern-faced individual with watchful eyes. The man approached with obvious displeasure at the conversation. "Miss Evelyn, your father will be expecting you back soon. We shouldn't delay." "Of course, Thomas." Evelyn's tone remained pleasant, but Austin detected a note of resignation. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps we'll have occasion to speak again." As Thomas helped Evelyn into a well-appointed buggy, Austin noticed something else that struck him as unusual. When she settled into her seat, her hands briefly touched the cushions and carriage walls in a way that seemed more exploratory than necessary for someone intimately familiar with the conveyance. It was as if she were confirming details rather than simply orienting herself. The general store's proprietor, William Hartman, emerged as the buggy departed. He was a stout man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the sort of honest demeanor that inspired trust. "Austin Blackwood," Hartman said with genuine warmth. "Heard you might be coming back to town. Sorry about old Pete Morrison. He was a good man." "That he was," Austin agreed. "I'm here to settle his affairs," as he asked. "Course you are. Pete always said you were the most reliable young man he'd ever hired. 20 years in the mountains, though that's a long time away from civilization." Austin nodded, but his attention was drawn to the departing buggy. "That was Evelyn Brennan, I take it." "Poor girl," Hartman said with sympathy. "Born blind, you know. Her father dotes on her something fierce, though some say he's a bit too protective. Can't hardly blame him, though losing his wife in childbirth and then having his only daughter born unable to see. It's been hard on the whole family. She seems remarkably capable for someone who's never seen the world," Austin observed. "Oh, she is that. Smart as a whip and kind to everyone she meets. It's a shame, really. With her father's wealth and position, she could have had any life she wanted, but the blindness limits her so. Horace Brennan has tried everything, brought in doctors from back east, even took her to specialists in San Francisco once. Nothing helped." Austin absorbed this information while something nagged at the back of his mind. He'd known blind people before mountain folk who'd lost their sight to accidents or illness. Their movements and mannerisms were distinctly different from what he'd observed in Evelyn. There was something about her behavior that didn't quite fit the pattern he'd come to recognize. "How long have you known the family?" Austin asked. "Since before Evelyn was born. I remember when Horace first brought his bride to Cedar Ridge. Beautiful woman, gentle soul, her death nearly broke him. When Evelyn was born blind, it seemed like more tragedy than one man should bear." "And Dr. Whitfield has been treating her all these years?" Dr. Whitfield and his father before him. "Old Doc Whitfield delivered Evelyn and confirmed her condition. The current doctor has continued her care ever since. Does what he can to help, though there's not much anyone can do for someone born that way." Austin filed away these details as he made arrangements for temporary lodging. Hartman directed him to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, a tidy establishment run by a widow who'd known Austin's family years before. The older woman welcomed him with the sort of motherly concern that comes from genuine affection. "You look thin, Austin Blackwood," Mrs. Patterson declared as she showed him to a clean, simple room. 20 years, eating whatever you could catch or forage in those mountains. I'll have some proper meals in you before the week's out." Mrs. Patterson had been the housekeeper at the Brennan Ranch for several years before opening her boarding house, and Austin sensed an opportunity to learn more about the family. "I met Evelyn Brennan this morning," Austin mentioned as Mrs. Patterson prepared his room. "Seems like a remarkable young woman, considering her challenges." Mrs. Patterson's expression grew careful. "She is that. Sweet girl. Always has been. Her father loves her dearly, though perhaps he protects her more than necessary. Must have been difficult, raising a blind child on a ranch." Horace did his best. Brought in tutors, made sure she had everything she needed. The house was modified to accommodate her condition. Railings, textured markers, everything. Arranged so she could navigate safely. "And she's never shown any signs of improvement? No changes in her condition over the years?" Mrs. Patterson paused in her arranging of fresh linens. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. I've known folks who lost their sight later in life, but someone born blind usually develops different ways of moving through the world. Miss Brennan seemed unusually attuned to visual cues for someone who's never seen." "You're very observant," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "But Evelyn's condition is well documented. Dr. Whitfield has extensive records of her treatments and examinations. She takes medication daily to help with complications related to her blindness." This detail surprised Austin. In his experience, blindness itself didn't typically require ongoing medication, unless there were underlying health issues or eye diseases that needed management. "What sort of complications?" he asked. "I'm not privy to the medical details," Mrs. Patterson replied, but her tone suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. "The important thing is that she's as healthy and happy as can be expected, given her circumstances." That evening, Austin walked the streets of Cedar Ridge, reacquainting himself with the town's rhythm and observing the changes that 2 decades had wrought. The Brennan influence was evident everywhere, in the quality of the roads, the prosperity of the businesses, and the deference shown whenever the family name was mentioned. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, Austin encountered Sheriff Reynolds, a man he'd known slightly before his departure. The sheriff was approaching 50, with graying temples and the steady demeanor of someone accustomed to maintaining order in a growing community. "Austin Blackwood," Reynolds said with cautious friendliness. "Heard you were back in town. Hear about Pete Morrison's affairs?" "That's right. Figured it was time to settle old debts and pay proper respects." "Good of you to come back. Pete thought highly of you, always said you'd make something of yourself given the chance." They shared a drink, while Austin listened to Reynolds describe the changes in Cedar Ridge. The conversation eventually turned to the Brennan family and their prominence in local affairs. "Horace Brennan's been good for this town," Reynolds said. "His investments brought the railroad through, and his cattle operations employ half the men in the county. Of course, he's had his share of troubles too. His daughter's condition, you mean? That, and other things. Running a business empire isn't easy, especially when you're trying to protect a disabled child at the same time. Horace has made some hard choices over the years, but they've generally worked out for the best." Austin sensed there was more to this story, but Reynolds seemed disinclined to elaborate. Instead, the sheriff changed the subject to Austin's plans for his stay in town. "Don't expect you'll be here long," Reynolds said. "Mountain life suits some men better than town living." "Depends on what I find here," Austin replied. "Sometimes a place calls to you in ways you don't expect." As Austin made his way back to the boarding house, he reflected on the day's encounters and the subtle undercurrents he'd detected. There was something about Evelyn Brennan's situation that didn't align with his understanding of blindness, and the careful way people spoke about her condition suggested secrets beneath the surface. His worn leather journal lay open on the small desk in his room as he recorded his observations, a habit developed during years of tracking animals and weather patterns in the mountains. Tonight, however, he found himself sketching not wildlife or landscape features, but the image of a young woman whose blindness seemed to follow rules that nature had never written. Tomorrow, he would begin settling Pete Morrison's affairs in earnest. But tonight, Austin Blackwood couldn't shake the feeling that Cedar Ridge held mysteries that had nothing to do with old debts and everything to do with the way truth could be hidden in plain sight, even from those who needed it most. 3 days into his stay in Cedar Ridge, Austin found himself at Hartman's General Store again, gathering supplies for his visit to Pete Morrison's old cabin. The familiar rhythm of small-town commerce surrounded him, the quiet conversations between neighbors, the careful inspection of goods, the unhurried pace of people who measured time by seasons rather than hours. He was examining a selection of rope when the store's bell announced another customer. Evelyn Brennan entered alone this time, moving with the same careful precision he'd observed before. Her fingers traced the doorframe briefly before she stepped inside, and she paused for just a moment, as if orienting herself to the space. "Good morning, Mr. Hartman," she called toward the counter. "I hope you received the fabric I ordered from Denver." "Right. Here, Miss Evelyn," Hartman replied warmly. "Came in on yesterday's train. Beautiful material. Your father has excellent taste." Austin watched as Evelyn made her way toward the counter, noting again the subtle inconsistencies in her movement. She navigated around a display of preserved goods that had been moved since her last visit, yet she seemed to know exactly where it was, without the careful exploration he'd expect from someone relying solely on memory and sound. As she reached for her package, a bolt of colorful fabric fell from the counter, unrolling across the floor in a cascade of deep blue silk. Austin stepped forward to help, but stopped when he saw Evelyn's reaction. For just an instant, no more than a heartbeat, her eyes seemed to track the movement of the falling fabric. She blinked and turned her head away quickly, but Austin's mountain-trained eyes had caught the telltale flicker of visual response. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Evelyn said, her voice carrying a note of what sounded almost like panic. "No harm done," Hartman assured her, hurrying around the counter. "Austin here will help us gather it up." As Austin knelt to collect the scattered fabric, he positioned himself where he could observe Evelyn's face. When he held up a section of the silk, allowing the morning light to catch its lustrous surface, he saw her eyes make the slightest movement toward the brightness. The response was so subtle that anyone not specifically watching for it would have missed it entirely. "Beautiful color," Austin commented, his voice deliberately casual. "Deep blue like a mountain lake at twilight." Evelyn's hands stilled for just a moment as she helped fold the fabric. "Father says it matches my mother's favorite dress. I'm having it made into curtains for the sitting room." "Your mother had good taste," Austin said, continuing to watch her reactions. "This shade of blue brings out the color in your eyes." It was an unusual comment to make to someone, supposedly born blind, but Austin wanted to see how she would respond. Evelyn's cheeks flushed slightly, and her hands moved to her face in a gesture that seemed almost self-conscious, the reaction of someone aware of their appearance rather than indifferent to it. "That's kind of you to say," she replied quietly. When they finished gathering the fabric, Austin noticed something else that struck him as odd. As Evelyn prepared to leave, she glanced, there was no other word for it, toward the window, where her escort waited with the buggy. The movement was quick and seemingly unconscious, but it was the sort of visual checking that sighted people did dozens of times each day without thinking. "Miss Evelyn," Austin said as she reached the door, "I wonder if you'd mind a question. I've been curious about the old Morrison place where I'm staying. Did you ever know Pete Morrison?" She turned back with genuine interest. "Oh yes, he was wonderful. He used to bring horses to the ranch for Father to examine. Always spoke to me as if I were just another person, not someone to be pitied or handled carefully. I was sorry to hear of his passing. He left some items he wanted distributed to people who'd been kind to him. I believe you were on his list." Evelyn's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. "Really? How thoughtful of him. Perhaps I could bring the item to the ranch sometime. I'm sure your father wouldn't mind a brief visit." The change in Evelyn's expression was immediate and telling. The warmth faded, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Father is very particular about visitors. Perhaps we could arrange for you to leave whatever it is with Thomas, our foreman." "Of course," Austin agreed, though her reaction had told him more than any direct answer could have. "I understand completely." After Evelyn departed, Austin lingered in the store, ostensibly examining merchandise, while his mind processed what he'd observed. Hartman seemed preoccupied with his ledgers, but Austin sensed the storekeeper had noticed the interaction. "Fine young woman," Austin commented. "Seems remarkably independent for someone with her challenges." Hartman looked up from his books, his expression careful. "The Brennan family has always been private about personal matters. Miss Evelyn's condition is a sensitive subject. I imagine it would be, though I couldn't help but notice she seems unusually responsive to visual stimuli for someone born blind." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meaning. Hartman set down his pen and regarded Austin with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You're very observant, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps too observant for your own good." "What do you mean by that?" "Cedar Ridge is a peaceful town because people mind their own business. The Brennan family has been good to this community, and they deserve respect and privacy." Austin heard the warning beneath the friendly words. "I'm not looking to cause trouble, just trying to understand what I'm seeing. Sometimes what we think we see isn't what's really there," Hartman replied, "especially when it comes to medical conditions we don't fully understand." That afternoon, Austin made his way to Pete Morrison's cabin, a modest structure on the outskirts of town that Pete had called home for 30 years. The old man's belongings were few but meaningful tools, worn smooth by decades of use. Books with carefully marked passages, and a small wooden box containing items he'd specifically designated for certain people. Among Pete's papers, Austin found something unexpected. A letter dated 2 years earlier, addressed to Pete but never sent. The return address was from a doctor, Samuel Henley in Denver, and the content made Austin's blood run cold. "Dear Pete," the letter read, "I've given considerable thought to our conversation about the Brennan girl. Your concerns about her condition are not unfounded. In my 40 years of medical practice, I've never seen a case of congenital blindness that presented with the symptoms you described. The medication regimen you mentioned is particularly troubling, as those compounds are typically used for very different purposes. I strongly urge you to encourage the family to seek a second opinion from an independent physician. If what you suspect is true, the situation requires immediate intervention." Austin read the letter 3 times, each reading confirming his growing suspicions. Pete Morrison had noticed the same inconsistencies that Austin was seeing, and a respected doctor in Denver had validated those concerns. The implications were staggering. As the sun began to set, Austin heard the approach of horses outside the cabin. Through the window, he saw 2 men dismounting Thomas, the foreman he'd met that morning, and another man he didn't recognize. Both wore expressions that suggested this wasn't a social call. Austin folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket before stepping outside to meet them. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas said, his voice formal and cold. "Mr. Brennan would like to speak with you." "About what?" "Your interest in his daughter's personal affairs." The second man, who had the look of someone accustomed to handling problems through force, stepped closer. "Mr. Brennan doesn't appreciate strangers asking questions about his family." Austin kept his voice level and calm. "I wasn't aware that normal conversation constituted asking questions about personal affairs. Normal conversation doesn't involve making observations about medical conditions you have no business discussing," Thomas replied. "Mr. Brennan is a patient man, but his patience has limits when it comes to his daughter's privacy." "I understand his concern for his daughter," Austin said. "Any father would want to protect his child." "Good. Then you'll understand why he's requesting that you conclude your business in Cedar Ridge and move on. Pete Morrison's affairs can be settled through the lawyer's office without requiring your continued presence." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Austin nodded slowly, giving no indication of the anger building inside him. "I'll consider Mr. Brennan's request," he said. "See that you do more than consider it," the unnamed man said, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. After they departed, Austin sat on Pete's front steps as darkness settled over the valley. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, its implications growing clearer with each passing moment. Pete Morrison had died before he could act on his suspicions, but he'd left behind evidence that validated everything Austin had observed. Evelyn Brennan wasn't born blind. Something else entirely was responsible for her condition, and her father was willing to use threats and intimidation to keep that secret buried. The question that remained was why a man would allow his own daughter to live in artificial darkness, and what he was willing to do to maintain that cruel deception. In his worn leather journal that night, Austin wrote not observations about wildlife or weather, but about broken spectacles hidden in shadows and the way truth could be more dangerous than any mountain predator. Tomorrow, he would begin asking different questions, not about blindness, but about the accident that had supposedly caused it, and about the medication that maintained it. The game had changed, and Austin Blackwood was no longer just settling an old friend's debts. He was uncovering a secret that someone was willing to kill to protect. Despite the warning from Horace Brennan's men, Austin remained in Cedar Ridge. He'd faced down mountain cats and survived winters that would have killed lesser men. He wasn't about to be intimidated by threats from a rancher with secrets to hide. However, he adjusted his approach, becoming more subtle in his inquiries and more careful about who he questioned. His first stop was the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, where weathered headstones told the stories of families who'd built the town. He found the grave of Margaret Brennan, Evelyn's mother, marked with an elaborate marble angel that spoke of wealth and grief in equal measure. The inscription read, "Beloved wife and mother, taken too soon, 1851 to 1874. If Evelyn was now 23, this timeline placed her birth in the same year as her mother's death. Near Margaret's grave, Austin discovered something interesting, a smaller headstone, almost hidden by overgrown grass, marked simply, "Baby Brennan, born and died 1871. This suggested that Evelyn hadn't been the Brennans' first child, information that no one in town had mentioned. The loss of an earlier child would have made Evelyn's birth 3 years later even more precious to a grieving father. At the town's small library, housed in the back room of the church, Austin sought out old newspapers that might shed light on the family's history. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Hutchins, proved to be a wealth of local knowledge, though she spoke in the careful way of someone who'd learned to measure her words. "Looking into local history?" she asked, as Austin examined bound volumes of the Cedar Ridge Gazette. "Trying to understand the town's development," Austin replied truthfully. "I'm curious about the major families and how they shaped the community." Mrs. Hutchins nodded approvingly. "The Brennans have been central to everything good that's happened here. Horace's investments brought prosperity to Cedar Ridge when other frontier towns were failing. And his daughter's condition must have been challenging for the family. A tragedy that tested his faith," Mrs. Hutchins agreed. "But he's been devoted to her care. The best doctors, constant attention to her needs, modifications to make life easier for her." She paused, studying Austin's face, "though I sometimes wonder if his protectiveness might be limiting her potential." "What do you mean? She's a bright young woman with so much to offer. Before her condition worsened, she used to come to town more often, participate in church activities, even helped with the children's Sunday school classes." Austin's attention sharpened. "Her condition worsened?" Mrs. Hutchins looked startled, as if she'd revealed something she hadn't intended. "I misspoke. Her blindness has always been the same, of course. I meant before her father became more protective about her safety." But Austin had caught the slip, and it aligned with his growing suspicions. If Evelyn's blindness was artificial, there might have been a period when it was less complete, before whatever treatment was being used became more effective or intensive. In the newspaper archives, Austin found scattered mentions of the Brennan family over the years. Most were routine social events, business announcements, charitable donations, but one item from 1881 caught his attention. A brief mention that Horace Brennan had traveled to Denver with his daughter for specialized medical consultations. The timing would have placed Evelyn at about 7 years old. More significantly, Austin discovered a gap in the newspaper's coverage during the summer of 1881. Several issues were missing from the bound volume, and when he asked Mrs. Hutchins about it, she became visibly uncomfortable. "Sometimes issues get damaged or lost over the years," she said evasively. "Small-town newspapers don't always have the best preservation methods." Austin suspected the missing issues might have contained information someone preferred to keep buried. The summer of 1881 seemed to be when whatever had happened to Evelyn occurred, the mysterious accident that had supposedly caused her blindness. That afternoon, Austin made his way to the feed store, where he hoped to gather supplies while engaging in casual conversation with the owner, Harold Fleming. Fleming was a talkative man in his 60s who'd lived in Cedar Ridge his entire life and seemed to know everyone's business. "Austin Blackwood," Fleming called out as Austin entered. "Heard you were back to settle Pete Morrison's affairs. Good man, Pete was. Always paid his bills on time and never had a harsh word for anyone. He spoke well of the people here," Austin agreed. "Said Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other." "That it is. Course, some neighbors need more looking after than others." Fleming's expression grew more serious. "Heard you've been asking questions about the Brennan family." Austin maintained a neutral expression. "Just making conversation. I remember Horace from before I left, though I'd never met his daughter. Sweet girl, though it's a shame about her condition. Horace has tried everything to help her, brought in specialists from back east, even took her to that fancy clinic in Denver years ago. Nothing worked, but you can't fault a father for trying. When was this trip to Denver? Oh, must have been 15, 16 years ago now. Evelyn was just a little thing. Horace had such hopes that the doctors there might be able to help her, but she came back just as blind as when she left. Broke his heart all over again." Austin filed away this information while browsing the store's offerings. As he selected items, he noticed something else. Interesting among Fleming's customer accounts was a regular monthly order for the Brennan Ranch that included several items that seemed unusual for a typical household. Specific medicinal compounds, imported salts, and chemical preparations that were more commonly associated with photographic processing or medical treatments. "Quite a variety of merchandise you carry," Austin observed, glancing at the shelves of chemical supplies. "Have to serve all kinds of customers," Fleming replied. "Ranchers need veterinary supplies, the doctor needs medicines, photographer needs his chemicals. Even have to special order items for some of the more particular customers." "Like the Brennan account?" Fleming's expression became guarded. "The Brennans pay well for privacy regarding their purchases. Dr. Whitfield handles their medical needs, and I just fill the orders he provides." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Dr. Whitfield was ordering specialized chemicals through the feed store rather than through normal medical supply channels. This suggested either that the medications weren't standard treatments or that he preferred to keep his orders away from official medical scrutiny. As Austin prepared to leave, Fleming called him back. "Word of advice, Austin. The Brennan family has been good to this town, and they value their privacy. Horace Brennan has been through enough heartache without folks stirring up old troubles." "What kind of old troubles?" Fleming hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to share information and knowing he'd already said too much. "Look, there was a time when people had questions about what happened to little Evelyn. Accidents like that, well, sometimes they don't make complete sense to folks on the outside. But Dr. Whitfield and his father before him confirmed her condition, and that should be enough for anyone." "What kind of accident?" I've said too much already. Point is, the girl's been well cared for, and her father's devoted his life to giving her the best existence possible. That ought to count for something. Austin left the feed store with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer picture of the conspiracy of silence that surrounded Evelyn's condition. The entire town seemed complicit in maintaining whatever fiction had been created to explain her blindness, whether from genuine belief or from pressure to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. That evening, Austin sat in his room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, reviewing his notes and sketching connections between the various pieces of information he'd gathered. Hidden in his jacket pocket were samples of the chemical compounds he'd managed to identify from Fleming's shelved substances that he intended to have analyzed by someone with more medical knowledge than a small-town feed store owner. The correspondence he'd found among Pete Morrison's papers included an address for Dr. Samuel Henley in Denver, the physician who'd expressed concerns about Evelyn's treatment. Tomorrow, Austin would compose a careful letter to Dr. Henley, sharing his observations and seeking medical insight into what kind of treatment might produce the effects he was witnessing. As he wrote in his leather journal that night, Austin reflected on the pattern of fear and secrecy that seemed to surround the Brennan family. Whatever had happened to Evelyn 16 years ago, it had created a web of complicity that extended throughout Cedar Ridge. Breaking through that wall of silence would require more than casual questions and careful observation. It would require proof that even Horace Brennan's influence couldn't suppress. The hidden correspondence in his possession was already dangerous enough to warrant threats. But Austin suspected that what he would discover next would make his current evidence seem insignificant by comparison. Austin's opportunity to search for more concrete evidence came sooner than expected. Mrs. Patterson mentioned over breakfast that she needed someone to deliver fresh linens to the Brennan ranch, as their usual delivery boy had taken ill. Austin volunteered immediately, recognizing the chance to observe the household more closely. The Brennan ranch house stood like a fortress against the morning sky, its imposing architecture speaking of wealth accumulated over decades. As Austin approached the main entrance with his delivery, he noted the unusual modifications that had been made to accommodate a blind resident textured handrails. Wind chimes, positioned, provide auditory landmarks, and carefully maintained pathways that eliminated obstacles. Yet, something about these accommodations struck him as theatrical, as if they were meant more to convince observers than to genuinely assist someone navigating without sight. The handrails were positioned at heights that would be awkward for regular use, and the wind chimes hung where they would be more decorative than functional. Thomas, the stern foreman, met Austin at the side entrance. "Mrs. Patterson's delivery," Austin said simply, holding up the bundled linens. "I'll take those," Thomas replied. But Austin had already glimpsed something through the open doorway that made his pulse quicken, a faded daguerreotype hanging in the hallway, showing a family portrait with a young girl who was unmistakably Evelyn, her eyes bright and clearly focused on the camera. "Impressive home," Austin commented, trying to see more of the interior. "Mr. Brennan takes pride in providing well for his family," Thomas said curtly, positioning himself to block Austin's view. "Your delivery is complete." But Austin had seen enough. The photograph was proof that Evelyn had possessed normal sight, at least long enough for that formal portrait to be taken. Based on her apparent age in the image, it would have been made when she was 5 or 6 years old, after the supposed birth blindness. But before the mysterious accident of 1881. As Austin prepared to leave, he heard Evelyn's voice from somewhere inside the house, speaking to what sounded like a tutor or companion. Her words were muffled, but her tone suggested frustration or distress. Thomas immediately stepped between Austin and the source of the voice, his expression warning against any curiosity. "Miss Evelyn has her lessons at this time," Thomas explained. "She requires quiet concentration." Austin nodded and departed, but not before noting the location of Evelyn's voice within the house and the defensive way Thomas had positioned himself. Whatever was happening during those lessons was something the family preferred to keep private. That afternoon, Austin received an unexpected visitor at Pete Morrison's cabin. Dr. Whitfield arrived in his medical buggy, ostensibly to check on Austin's health after his years in the mountains, but clearly with another agenda. Dr. Whitfield was a man in his late 40s, with the soft features of someone who lived comfortably but carried the burden of unpleasant secrets. His examination of Austin was perfunctory, but his questions were pointed. "I understand you've been asking questions about the Brennan family, Doctor," Whitfield said, as he packed his medical bag. "I've had a few conversations with folks in town," Austin replied carefully. "Miss Evelyn's condition is a complex medical matter that requires specialized understanding. Her treatment regimen has been carefully calibrated over many years to manage her symptoms and prevent complications." "What kind of complications?" Dr. Whitfield hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Congenital blindness often involves underlying neurological factors that can worsen without proper intervention. Miss Evelyn requires daily medication to prevent seizures and other serious complications that could threaten her life." Austin absorbed this information while studying the doctor's demeanor. Something about the explanation felt rehearsed, as if Dr. Whitfield had delivered this same justification many times before. "That must be challenging for her," Austin said, "taking medication daily for such a serious condition. It's a small price to pay for maintaining her health and stability. Her father ensures she never misses a dose. It's become as routine as taking meals. And this medication helps with the blindness itself? The medication manages the underlying condition that causes the blindness. Without it, her symptoms would be much worse." Dr. Whitfield snapped his bag shut with a finality. "I hope you understand that discussing medical conditions with laypeople can create unnecessary anxiety and confusion. Miss Evelyn's care is best left to qualified professionals." After the doctor departed, Austin reflected on the conversation and its implications. If Evelyn was indeed taking daily medication that somehow maintained her blindness, then stopping that medication might restore her sight. But it would also mean that for 16 years she'd been systematically poisoned by the very people who claimed to love and protect her. The possibility was so monstrous that Austin found it difficult to fully accept, yet the evidence continued to point in that direction. A father might go to extraordinary lengths to protect his daughter from some external threat, but what could justify deliberately maintaining such a cruel deception? Austin's answer came that evening, when he made a discovery that changed everything. While organizing Pete Morrison's papers, he found a Create discovery: hidden envelope tucked inside an old ledger, an envelope containing a photograph and a letter that Pete had apparently hidden for safekeeping. The photograph showed a young Evelyn, perhaps 6 years old, standing beside a man Austin didn't recognize. The girl's eyes were bright and alert, clearly focused on something beyond the camera's frame. But it was the letter that accompanied the photograph that made Austin's blood run cold. The letter was dated 1881 and written in a shaky hand that suggested extreme distress. "Pete, if something happens to me, please ensure this reaches someone who can help my granddaughter. Horace has made a deal with the devil, and Evelyn is paying the price. The medication they're giving her isn't treating blindness, it's causing it. Dr. Whitfield and his father have been part of this from the beginning, but I have proof that the child was born with perfect sight. The accident never happened. Horace needed collateral for his debts, and they convinced of him that temporarily blinding Evelyn would satisfy the creditors while keeping her safe from worse harm. But temporary became permanent when the payments were never met. Now they're trapped in their own lie, and my granddaughter suffers for it. The chemicals are destroying her optic nerves gradually. Soon the damage will be irreversible." Margaret's father, Samuel Hutchins. Austin read the letter 3 times, each reading confirming the horrific truth. Evelyn's grandfather had discovered the conspiracy and tried to expose it, but had died before he could act. The letter was signed by Samuel Hutchins, undoubtedly related to Mrs. Hutchins at the library, which explained her careful manner when discussing the Brennan family. The implications were staggering. Evelyn's blindness was artificial, maintained through daily doses of chemicals that were gradually destroying her vision permanently. What had begun as a temporary solution to financial problems had become a permanent prison, and with each passing day, the possibility of restoring her sight diminished. Austin carefully folded the letter and photograph, his hands trembling with anger and determination. He now possessed proof of one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, a father systematically poisoning his own daughter to maintain a lie that had grown beyond his control. The question now was how to use this evidence to save Evelyn before the damage became irreversible, while staying alive long enough to see justice done. Horace Brennan had already demonstrated his willingness to use threats and intimidation. When faced with evidence that could destroy him and send him to prison for attempted murder, there was no telling how far he might go to protect his secret. As Austin secured the evidence in his leather journal, he realized that his investigation had moved far beyond settling an old friend's debts. He was now the only person who could save Evelyn Brennan from a fate worse than the blindness she'd been told was her natural condition, the fate of losing her sight forever to satisfy her father's desperate bargain with unknown creditors. Tomorrow, he would begin the dangerous process of determining how to approach Evelyn with the truth, while preparing for the violent reaction that would inevitably follow when her father realized that his carefully constructed lie was finally crumbling. Armed with the devastating evidence from Samuel Hutchins' letter, Austin knew he needed medical expertise to understand exactly what was being done to Evelyn and how to reverse it. The following morning, he rode to the telegraph office and sent a carefully worded message to Dr. Samuel Henley in Denver, the physician Pete Morrison had contacted years earlier. The reply came within 2 days, and Dr. Henley's response confirmed Austin's worst fears. The doctor agreed to meet Austin halfway in the town of Millerville to examine the evidence and provide guidance. Austin made arrangements to travel there under the pretense of conducting business for Pete Morrison's estate. Dr. Henley proved to be a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with serious medical mysteries. When Austin presented Samuel Hutchins' letter and the chemical evidence he'd gathered, the doctor's expression grew increasingly grave. "This is one of the most horrific cases of medical abuse I've encountered," Dr. Henley said, after examining Austin's documentation. "If these compounds are being administered daily as described, they would gradually destroy the optic nerve while creating the appearance of congenital blindness. Is the damage reversible? That depends on how long the treatment has continued and the concentration of the chemicals involved. The human optic nerve has remarkable resilience, but prolonged exposure to certain compounds can cause permanent damage." Dr. Henley studied the chemical samples Austin had obtained. These particular substances suggest a sophisticated understanding of ocular pharmacology. Someone with advanced medical training designed this regimen. Dr. Whitfield and his father have been the family physicians for decades. Then they're both complicit in attempted murder, Dr. Henley stated bluntly. What you're describing is a slow poisoning designed to maintain artificial blindness while appearing to treat a non-existent condition. Dr. Henley provided Austin with detailed instructions for gradually reducing the chemical doses to minimize withdrawal effects while allowing Evelyn's natural vision to return. He also gave Austin a letter addressed to territorial authorities, documenting the medical evidence and his professional opinion that a crime was being committed. However, Dr. Henley warned, approaching this situation requires extreme caution. If the perpetrators realize their scheme is being exposed, they might resort to more drastic measures to silence both you and Miss Brennan. Austin returned to Cedar Ridge with a clear plan but a heavy heart. The evidence was now overwhelming, but acting on it would require delicate timing and careful preparation. His first priority was finding a way to communicate with Evelyn without alerting her father or Dr. Whitfield to his intentions. His opportunity came when Mrs. Patterson mentioned that Evelyn had requested additional books from the library. Austin volunteered to make the delivery, knowing that Thomas would likely be supervising ranch operations during the afternoon hours. When Austin arrived at the Brennan Ranch, he was indeed met by a housekeeper rather than Thomas. The woman, middle-aged and seemingly harried, accepted the books gratefully. "Miss Evelyn will be so pleased," she said. "She's been feeling poorly lately, headaches and such. Reading helps distract her from the discomfort." Austin's pulse quickened. Headaches were a common symptom when chemical dependencies were interrupted or when the body began fighting against artificial treatments. "I hope she feels better soon," Austin said. "If you don't mind my asking, has she been taking her usual medication?" The housekeeper looked surprised by the question. "Oh, yes. Dr. Whitfield is very strict about that. Twice daily, never missed. Though between you and me, I sometimes wonder if the medicine isn't making her feel worse instead of better." "What makes you think that?" The woman glanced around nervously. "I probably shouldn't say, but she seems more alert and aware when she first wakes up, before taking her morning dose. It's as if the medicine clouds her mind somehow." This observation aligned perfectly with Dr. Henley's explanation of how the chemicals would affect Evelyn's system. Austin realized he was speaking with someone who might become an ally in his efforts to help Evelyn. "I'm sure Dr. Whitfield knows what's best," Austin said carefully, "but it's natural to have concerns when someone you care about seems to be suffering." "That's exactly how I feel," the housekeeper agreed. "Miss Evelyn is such a sweet girl, and she's been through so much. Sometimes I think her father's protectiveness might be preventing her from getting the help she really needs." Austin sensed an opening. "If you ever felt that Miss Evelyn needed different care, would you be willing to help arrange it?" The housekeeper studied Austin's face intently. "You're the man who's been asking questions about the family, aren't you? Thomas warned us about you. I'm someone who cares about Miss Evelyn's welfare," Austin replied honestly. "And I have reason to believe she's not receiving the medical care she actually needs." Before the housekeeper could respond, they heard Evelyn's voice calling from inside the house. Her tone suggested distress, and the housekeeper immediately hurried toward the sound. Austin followed, concerned about what they might find. They discovered Evelyn in the library, sitting among scattered books, with her hands pressed to her temples. Her face was pale, and she seemed to be fighting against severe pain. "The headache is getting worse," Evelyn said weakly. "And I keep seeing strange lights and shadows. It's frightening." Austin exchanged a meaningful look with the housekeeper. The symptoms Evelyn described were consistent with her optic nerves attempting to function normally while being suppressed by chemical interference. "When did this start?" Austin asked gently. "A few days ago, Doctor. Whitfield says it's a normal progression of my condition, but it feels different from anything I've experienced before." Evelyn looked up in Austin's general direction. "Is that you, Mr. Blackwood?" "Yes. I brought your books from the library." "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness, though I'm not sure I'll be able to read them while these symptoms persist." Austin made a decision that would irrevocably commit him to a dangerous course of action. "Miss Evelyn, what if I told you that your symptoms might not be related to your blindness, but to something else entirely?" The housekeeper gasped softly, recognizing the implications of Austin's words. Evelyn's expression became very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes the treatments we receive for one condition can create other problems. Have you ever considered seeking a second medical opinion?" "Father says that, Doctor. Whitfield is the most qualified physician in the territory to treat my condition." "And he may be," Austin agreed carefully. "But even the most qualified doctors can benefit from consulting with colleagues, especially when symptoms change or worsen." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her hands still pressed to her temples. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of desperate hope. "Mr. Blackwood, Do you believe there might be something that could help me feel better? I believe there are always possibilities we haven't explored, Austin replied, and I believe you deserve to have every option investigated thoroughly. The housekeeper stepped forward with obvious determination. Miss Evelyn, if Mr. Blackwood knows of a doctor who might help you, perhaps we should listen to what he has to say. Austin realized he had found an unexpected ally in the Brennan household, someone who cared enough about Evelyn to risk challenging the established order. With careful planning and this woman's help, he might be able to begin the process of gradually reducing Evelyn's medication while building evidence to expose the conspiracy that had stolen 16 years of her life. But he also knew that taking this step would put all of them in immediate danger from men who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their secret. The housekeeper, who introduced herself as Mary Caldwell, proved to be more than just a sympathetic ear. That evening, she sought out Austin at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house with information that would change everything. "I've worked for the Brennan family for 8 years. Mary said quietly as they sat in the parlor. "I've seen things that never sat right with me, but I never had anyone to talk to about my concerns." "What kind of things?" Mary reached into her apron and withdrew a small leather portfolio. "Miss Evelyn draws," she said simply. "She thinks no one knows, but I've seen her work. Look at these." Austin opened the portfolio and felt his breath catch. Inside were dozens of detailed sketches, landscapes, portraits, still life studies, all executed with the precision and accuracy that could only come from direct visual observation. The drawings showed intimate knowledge of light, shadow, and perspective that would be impossible for someone who had never seen. "When does she create these?" Austin asked, studying a particularly detailed rendering of the view from her bedroom window. "Usually in the early morning, before her first dose of medicine. She hides them immediately afterward, as if she knows they're evidence of something she's not supposed to be able to do." Austin examined the drawings more carefully. The earlier sketches, based on dates Mary had noted, showed hesitant lines and uncertain proportions. But the more recent work demonstrated increasing confidence and skill, as if Evelyn's vision was gradually improving despite the medication she was receiving. "Has there been any change in her medication routine recently?" Austin asked. "Not that I'm aware of, but Dr. Whitfield has seemed more concerned during his visits. He's been asking more questions about her symptoms and behavior." Mary hesitated before continuing. "There's something else. Miss Evelyn has been questioning her treatment for the first time since I've worked here." "What kind of questions?" "Yesterday she asked me why she needs to take medicine for blindness, when blind people in town manage without any medication at all. She's never asked anything like that before." Austin realized that Evelyn's natural intelligence was beginning to overcome the chemical suppression that had clouded her thinking for years. Her body was fighting back, and her mind was starting to recognize the inconsistencies in her situation. "Mary, I need to tell you something that will be difficult to hear," Austin said carefully. "Miss Evelyn's blindness isn't natural. It's being maintained artificially through the medication she receives." Mary's face went white. "That's impossible. Why would anyone do such a thing?" Austin showed her Samuel Hutchins' letter and explained what Dr. Henley had told him about the chemical compounds. As he spoke, Mary's expression moved from shock to horror, to a fierce determination that reminded Austin of a mother bear protecting her cub. "Those monsters," Mary whispered. "That poor, sweet girl has been poisoned for years, and she doesn't even know it. The question now is how we help her without putting her in greater danger. If her father realizes we know the truth, there's no telling what he might do." Mary was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. When she spoke again, her voice carried steel resolve. "I prepare Miss Evelyn's meals and bring her the medicine Dr. Whitfield provides. If you can tell me how to reduce the doses gradually, I can make sure she gets less of the poison without anyone noticing." Austin felt a surge of respect for the woman's courage. "It won't be without risk," If we're caught, the consequences could be severe for all of us. Miss Evelyn deserves a chance at a real life, Mary replied firmly. I've watched her live in artificial darkness for 8 years. If there's a way to give her back her sight, I'll do whatever it takes. They spent the next hour planning how to implement Dr. Henley's instructions. Mary would gradually reduce the concentration of Evelyn's medication by diluting it with harmless substances that would maintain the appearance and taste. Austin would monitor Evelyn's progress and watch for any signs that their activities had been discovered. There's one more thing, Mary said as they prepared to part. Mr. Brennan has been receiving visitors lately, men who come at night and leave before dawn. They don't look like regular business associates. Can you describe them? Well-dressed but rough around the edges. The kind of men who carry guns and know how to use them. Thomas meets with them in the barn, away from the main house. Austin absorbed this information with growing concern. If Horace Brennan was meeting with hired guns, it suggested he was preparing for the possibility of his secret being exposed. The stakes of their rescue mission had just increased dramatically. Over the following days, Austin watched carefully for any change in Evelyn's condition. Mary reported that the gradual reduction in medication was proceeding smoothly, with no apparent notice from Dr. Whitfield or Thomas. More importantly, Evelyn's symptoms were beginning to improve. The headaches are less severe, Mary told Austin during one of their discreet meetings. And yesterday morning, before her medicine, she described the color of her dress with perfect accuracy. When I asked how she knew, she looked confused and said she must have remembered it from when someone told her what she was wearing. Austin felt a surge of hope mixed with urgency. Evelyn's vision was returning, but she didn't yet understand what was happening to her. Soon, the changes would become too obvious to hide, and they would need to be prepared for the violent reaction that would inevitably follow. His concerns proved justified when 3 days later, Dr. Whitfield arrived at the ranch for an unscheduled visit. Austin watched from a distance as the doctor spent an unusual amount of time examining Evelyn and asking detailed questions about her recent symptoms. That evening, Mary brought disturbing news. Dr. Whitfield wants to increase Miss Evelyn's medication dosage. He says her recent symptoms indicate that her condition is becoming unstable and requires more intensive treatment. Austin realized they had reached a critical juncture. Dr. Whitfield had noticed the improvement in Evelyn's condition and was attempting to counteract their efforts by increasing the chemical suppression. If they allowed the dosage to be increased, all their progress would be lost, and Evelyn's chances of recovery might be permanently damaged. We can't let that happen, Austin said firmly. How much time do we have? He's bringing the new medication tomorrow morning. He plans to administer the first dose himself to ensure it's properly measured. Austin made a decision that would commit them all to an irreversible course of action. Then, tomorrow morning, is when we tell Evelyn the truth. She needs to understand what's happening to her and make her own choice about her treatment. Mary nodded, though her face reflected the fear they both felt. What if she doesn't believe us? What if she thinks we're the ones trying to harm her? Then we'll have to trust that 16 years of artificial blindness haven't destroyed her ability to recognize the truth when she sees it, Austin replied, because after tomorrow, there won't be any going back for any of us. As Austin prepared for what might be the most important conversation of his life, he reflected on how a simple mission to settle an old friend's debts had evolved into a desperate race to save a young woman's sight and possibly her life. The drawings hidden in Evelyn's portfolio were proof that her true self was fighting to emerge from years of chemical suppression. Tomorrow, they would discover whether love and truth were strong enough to overcome a conspiracy built on greed and maintained through fear. The confrontation Austin had been preparing for came earlier than expected. At dawn, before Dr. Whitfield's scheduled arrival, Austin and Mary found themselves facing a crisis that would force their hand immediately. Mary arrived at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house in a state of panic, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Mr. Blackwood, you have to come quickly. Miss Evelyn's disappeared from her room, and Mr. Brennan is beside himself." Austin dressed rapidly and followed Mary to the ranch, where they found chaos. Thomas and several ranch hands were scouring the property, while Horace Brennan paced the front porch with the agitated energy of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "When was she discovered missing?" Austin asked Mary as they approached the house. "About an hour ago. Her bed hadn't been slept in, and her window was open. Mr. Brennan is convinced she's been kidnapped, but I think she may have left on her own." Austin's suspicions were confirmed when he examined Evelyn's room. The missing items told a story: her warmest cloak, sturdy walking boots, and a small satchel that usually contained her personal belongings. Most tellingly, the portfolio containing her secret drawings was gone. "She wasn't taken," Austin told Mary quietly. "She chose to leave. The question is, why, and where she might have gone." Their answer came in the form of a note discovered tucked beneath her pillow, a note that only Mary would have known to look for, written in Evelyn's careful handwriting. "Mary, I know you and Mr. Blackwood have been trying to help me, and I'm grateful for your kindness. But I've begun to understand things that terrify me about my own life. Last night, I could see the moonlight through my window clearly enough to read the time on my mantel clock. I know that's impossible for someone born blind, which means everything I've been told about myself is a lie. I've taken my drawings as proof of what I've been seeing, and I'm going to find someone who can tell me the truth about my condition. Please don't follow me. I need to discover the truth on my own terms. E.B. Austin felt his blood turn cold. Evelyn had figured out the conspiracy on her own, but she had no understanding of the danger she was walking into. Worse, she had physical evidence that could expose the entire scheme, making her a target for anyone desperate to keep the secret buried. "Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" Austin asked Mary. "She's mentioned the old mission church in the mountains several times. She says it's the only place where she feels truly peaceful. But Mr. Blackwood, she's never traveled anywhere alone. She doesn't understand how dangerous it is for a young woman in the wilderness." Austin was preparing to set out in pursuit when Thomas approached, his expression grim. "Mr. Brennan wants to speak with you immediately," Thomas said. "He has questions about your recent conversations with Miss Evelyn." Austin had no choice but to follow Thomas to the main house, where he found Horace Brennan in his study with two men Austin didn't recognize. The strangers had the hard look of professional gunmen, and their presence confirmed Austin's worst fears about the lengths to which Brennan was prepared to go. Horace Brennan was a man transformed by desperation. The careful composure Austin had observed during their previous encounters had been replaced by the wild-eyed determination of someone whose back was against the wall. "Mr. Blackwood," Brennan said without preamble, "my daughter has disappeared, and I have reason to believe you're involved." "I'm concerned about Miss Evelyn's safety," Austin replied carefully. "If she's missing, we should be organizing a proper search party." "Don't play games with me," Brennan snapped. "I know you've been asking questions about her condition and interfering with her medical care. What have you told her?" Austin realized that his options had narrowed to a single, dangerous choice. With Evelyn in the wilderness, carrying evidence that could expose the conspiracy, and with hired guns in the room, there was no longer any point in maintaining pretenses. "I've told her nothing," Austin said, "but she's figured out the truth on her own. She knows her blindness isn't natural." The silence that followed was deafening. Horace Brennan's face went ashen, while the two gunmen exchanged glances that suggested they were prepared for violence. "That's impossible," Brennan whispered. "She's been blind since birth. The accident." "There was no accident," Austin interrupted, "and you know it. I have Samuel Hutchins' letter, Doctor, Henley's medical analysis, and now Evelyn has her own drawings as proof that she can see. The only question is how long you thought you could maintain this monstrous lie." Horace Brennan aged 10 years in the space of a heartbeat. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment Austin saw not a powerful rancher but a broken man who had made a terrible choice years ago and had been trapped by its consequences ever since. "You don't understand," Brennan said quietly. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." One of the gunmen stepped forward. "Mr. Brennan, we don't have time for confessions. Where is the girl, and what evidence does she have?" Austin realized he was witnessing a confrontation between Horace Brennan and the true architects of the conspiracy. These men weren't employees, they were the creditors who had demanded Evelyn's blindness as collateral for her father's debts. "You bastards," Austin said, understanding flooding through him. "You're the ones who designed this whole scheme. Brennan's been as much a victim as his daughter." The lead gunman, a cold-eyed man with silver hair, smiled without warmth. "Mr. Brennan borrowed a substantial sum of money 20 years ago to save his ranch from bankruptcy. When he couldn't repay the loan, we offered him an alternative arrangement: his daughter's temporary incapacitation in exchange for an extension on the debt." "Temporary?" Horace Brennan said bitterly. "You promised it would be temporary just until I could get back on my feet financially." "And it would have been," the gunman continued, "if you had honored your end of the bargain. Instead, you used the time we gave you to become wealthy and powerful, while conveniently forgetting your obligations to us." Austin began to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Horace Brennan had agreed to temporarily blind his daughter to buy time to repay his debts, but had then reneged on the agreement, leaving Evelyn trapped in artificial blindness while he built his fortune. "The original business contract," Austin said, remembering the artifact he'd theorized about. "You have documentation of this arrangement." The silver-haired man reached into his jacket and withdrew a yellowed document, a legally binding agreement signed by Mr. Brennan in 1881, stipulating the terms of his daughter's collateral arrangement. "We've been patient for 16 years, but our patience has limits." Austin scanned the document with growing horror. It outlined in clinical detail how Evelyn would be rendered temporarily blind through chemical means, with her sight to be restored upon full repayment of the debt. But a clause at the bottom made clear that failure to repay within 5 years would make the arrangement permanent. "You've had 16 years to repay your debt," the second gunman said to Brennan. "Instead, you've gotten rich while your daughter paid the price for your cowardice." "I tried," Brennan protested weakly. "I sent payments when I could, but you kept increasing the interest, adding fees." "Excuses." The silver-haired man cut him off. "The debt stands, and now your daughter has evidence that could expose our entire operation. That makes her a liability we can't afford." Austin felt ice form in his veins. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Miss Brennan's unfortunate disappearance into the dangerous mountain wilderness will be a tragedy that the whole community will mourn. A blind girl, lost and alone, such accidents happen all too often." The threat was unmistakable. These men intended to kill Evelyn to protect their secret, and they had the resources and ruthlessness to make her death appear accidental. "I won't let you harm her," Austin said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "You're not in a position to prevent anything," the gunman replied. "Thomas here will guide us to where you think she might have gone, while you and Mr. Brennan remain here to ensure your cooperation." Austin realized that Evelyn was walking into a trap that had been decades in the making. The original debt that had started her ordeal had evolved into something far more sinister, a criminal organization that used kidnapping and extortion to control wealthy families throughout the territory. But as dire as the situation appeared, Austin had one advantage that these men didn't know about. Mary Caldwell had overheard the entire conversation from the hallway, and she was already slipping out the back door to warn the sheriff and organize help. The question was whether they could reach Evelyn before the gunmen tracked her down in the wilderness, and whether she would trust them enough to accept their help when they found her. As the silver-haired man began issuing orders for the pursuit, Austin caught a glimpse of something that gave him hope. Through the study window, he could see riders approaching the ranch, Sheriff Reynolds and several deputies, alerted by Mary's desperate message. The conspiracy that had trapped Evelyn in darkness for 16 years was finally being exposed, but the most dangerous part of her ordeal was just beginning. The arrival of Sheriff Reynolds and his deputies transformed the tense standoff in Horace Brennan's study into chaos. Mary Caldwell had done more than simply alert the law she had brought with her doctor. Henley from Denver, who had arrived on the morning train with territorial marshals and warrants for arrest. The silver-haired gunman and his companion found themselves surrounded, but their years of criminal experience had prepared them for such contingencies. As the lawmen burst through the front door, the gunmen grabbed Horace Brennan as a human shield and began backing toward a rear exit. "Nobody moves, or Brennan dies," the leader shouted, pressing his revolver against Horace's temple. "We came here to collect a debt, and we're leaving with what we're owed." Austin used the confusion to position himself near the window, where he could see Thomas leading a group of ranch hands toward the old mountain trail. Evelyn was out there somewhere, alone and unaware that killers were tracking her through the wilderness. Sheriff Reynolds attempted to negotiate with the gunman, while Dr. Henley examined the business contract and Samuel Hutchins' letter that Austin had preserved. The doctor's face grew increasingly grim as he read the documents. "Sheriff, Doctor," Henley called out, "these documents prove that Miss Brennan has been the victim of systematic poisoning for 16 years. This is attempted murder on a massive scale." The silver-haired gunman laughed bitterly. "Attempted? Doctor, we've been operating this scheme across 4 territories for the past 20 years. Miss Brennan is just one of dozens of children who've served as collateral for their parents' debts." Austin felt his stomach turn. The conspiracy was far larger than he'd imagined, a criminal enterprise that had been destroying lives across the frontier for decades. "You're admitting to multiple kidnappings and assaults," Sheriff Reynolds said, trying to maintain his negotiating position while his deputies moved into strategic positions. "I'm admitting to running a business," the gunman replied. "Rich families borrow money they can't repay, and we provide them with creative solutions. Temporary disabilities, mysterious illnesses, convenient accidents, all reversible upon full payment of debts." "Horace." Brennan found his voice for the first time since the confrontation began. "You promised Evelyn's blindness would be temporary. You said 5 years at most, and it would have been if you'd honored your agreement. Instead, you used our arrangement to build a fortune while leaving your daughter to suffer. That changes the terms considerably." Austin realized that every moment spent in negotiation was time that Evelyn's pursuers were using to track her down. He caught Sheriff Reynolds' eye and gestured toward the window, indicating his intention to slip away and join the pursuit. Reynolds gave an almost imperceptible nod while continuing to engage the gunman in conversation. Austin eased toward the door, but before he could escape, the second gunman spotted his movement. "The mountain man stays put," the gunman ordered. "He's already caused enough trouble by interfering with our business." Austin's hand moved instinctively to his father's pocket watch, the weight of it in his vest, providing comfort and resolve. His father had been a man of uncompromising integrity, someone who believed that doing right was more important than staying safe. Austin drew strength from that memory as he prepared to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. "Your business," Austin said, turning to face the gunman directly, "involves torturing innocent children to collect debts from their parents. That's not business, that's evil." "Evil is a matter of perspective," the silver-haired man replied. "We provide services that help families avoid bankruptcy, foreclosure, and complete financial ruin. The temporary inconvenience to one family member prevents disaster for the entire household." "Temporary," Dr. Henley interjected, studying the medical evidence. "According to these dosage records, Miss Brennan's treatment would have caused permanent blindness within another year. There was never any intention of reversing her condition." The admission hung in the air like Smoke from a gunshot. Horace Brennan's face crumpled as he realized the full extent of his daughter's ordeal and his own culpability in maintaining it. "Dear God," Brennan whispered. "Evelyn, what have I done to you?" Austin saw his opportunity in the moment of distraction. He lunged toward the window, smashing through the glass as gunshots erupted behind him. Pain flared in his shoulder where a bullet grazed him, but he rolled to his feet and sprinted toward the stable where his horse waited. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of a full-scale gunfight as the law enforcement officers engaged the criminals. But Austin's focus was entirely on reaching Evelyn before Thomas and the ranch hands could deliver her to the men who wanted her dead. Austin's years in the mountains had taught him to read terrain and track movement with skills that surpassed even experienced frontiersmen. As he followed the trail toward the old mission church, he could see the signs of multiple parties. Moving through the wilderness, Evelyn's light footprints, barely visible in the soft earth, and the heavier tracks of Thomas and his men following perhaps an hour behind her. More troubling were the additional signs he discovered. The hoofprints of horses that had arrived from a different direction, suggesting that the gunman had already positioned other men in the mountains to intercept Evelyn if she tried to reach the mission. Austin pushed his horse harder, knowing that every minute of delay increased the danger to Evelyn. His shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but the pain only sharpened his focus on the task ahead. The old mission church sat in a valley between two ridges, its adobe walls weathered by decades of mountain storms. As Austin approached, he could see smoke rising from the chimney, indicating that someone was inside. His heart leaped with hope, but caution made him dismount and approach on foot. Through a window, he glimpsed Evelyn sitting beside. A small fire, her portfolio of drawings spread before her. Her face showed a mixture of wonder and fear as she examined her own artwork, finally understanding what her eyes had been telling her despite years of chemical suppression. But Austin also saw movement in the surrounding woods, armed men positioning themselves around the mission, preparing to close the trap. Thomas emerged from the tree line, leading two ranch hands toward the front door of the church. Austin realized he had arrived at the exact moment when all the converging forces of the conspiracy would collide. Evelyn was about to be confronted by men she trusted, who were preparing to deliver her to killers she didn't even know existed. Drawing on every skill his mountain years had taught him, Austin began moving through the forest toward the church, using cover and concealment to avoid detection by the men surrounding the building. His father's pocket watch ticked steadily against his chest, its rhythm matching his heartbeat, as he prepared to risk everything for a young woman he'd known for less than 2 weeks. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 20 years in solitude, avoiding the complications and responsibilities that came with caring about other people. Now he was about to engage in a gunfight against overwhelming odds to save someone whose life had become more important to him than his own survival. As Austin reached the edge of the clearing surrounding the mission, he heard Thomas calling out to Evelyn, his voice carrying false warmth and concern. "Miss Evelyn, your father's been worried sick about you. We're here to take you home safely." Through the window, Austin saw Evelyn's reaction, a mixture of relief and uncertainty that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Thomas's reassurances. Her recent discoveries about her own condition had apparently made her more cautious about trusting the people who had been controlling her life. Austin knew he had only moments to act before Evelyn was convinced to leave the relative safety of the mission. Once she was in the open, surrounded by men with guns, her chances of survival would diminish rapidly. He checked his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded, and said a silent prayer to whatever gods watched over fools who fought against impossible odds for the sake of doing what was right. His father's pocket watch seemed to tick louder as Austin prepared to step into the clearing and announce his presence to men who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill. But sometimes, he reflected, the most important battles were the ones where victory seemed impossible, and retreat would mean abandoning everything that made life worth living. Evelyn Brennan deserved a chance at a real life, free from the artificial darkness that had been imposed upon her by the greed and desperation of others. If Austin could give her that chance, the risk to his own life seemed a small price to pay for such a worthy cause. The time for careful planning and subtle maneuvering had passed. Now, there was only the clear, simple choice between right and wrong, and Austin Blackwood had never been a man who struggled with such decisions. Austin stepped into the clearing, with his hands raised, hoping to buy time through negotiation rather than immediately resorting to gunfire. His sudden appearance startled Thomas and the ranch hands, who had been focused on coaxing Evelyn from the mission church. "Thomas!" Austin called out, his voice carrying across the small valley. "We need to talk before this goes any further." "Austin Blackwood," Thomas replied, his hand moving to his gun. "You're supposed to be dead by now. The boss isn't going to be happy about your interference." "The boss has bigger problems than me," Austin said, stepping closer while keeping his hands visible. "Sheriff Reynolds has arrested the men from back east, and Dr. Henley has documented evidence of the conspiracy. It's over, Thomas." Through the mission window, Austin could see Evelyn listening to the conversation with growing confusion and alarm. Her portfolio of drawings lay open before her, and even from a distance, Austin could see her making connections between what she was hearing and what her own artwork had been telling her about her condition. "Nothing's over until we complete our job," Thomas said grimly. "Miss Evelyn comes with us, and you disappear permanently. Those are our orders." "Whose orders, Thomas? Horace Brennan's, or the men who've been holding his daughter hostage for 16 years? Thomas hesitated, and Austin saw uncertainty flicker across his face. The foreman had served the Brennan family loyally for years, but he was beginning to understand that his loyalty had been manipulated to serve criminal purposes. "Mr. Brennan loves his daughter," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Horace Brennan has been blackmailed into poisoning his own daughter," Austin replied. "The men you're working for never intended to restore her sight. They were planning to kill her to hide their crimes." From inside the mission, Evelyn's voice rang out with startling clarity. "Is that true? Have I been poisoned?" The sound of her voice, strong, intelligent, and demanding answers, seemed to break something inside Thomas. Austin watched as years of suppressed doubts and uncomfortable questions finally surfaced in the foreman's expression. "Miss Evelyn," Thomas called toward the church, "your father's been trying to protect you from people who wanted to hurt you worse than anything you've experienced. By lying to me about being blind." Evelyn appeared in the mission doorway, clutching her portfolio against her chest. "By making me take medicine that was slowly destroying my sight permanently." Austin felt his heart clench at the pain in her voice, but also at the courage she was showing by confronting the truth directly. The young woman who emerged from the mission was different from the carefully protected invalid he'd first met. This was someone who had discovered her own strength and refused to be managed or manipulated any longer. "The medicine was supposed to be temporary," Thomas said weakly. "Your father was told it would wear off when the debt was paid. What debt could possibly justify blinding your own child?" Evelyn demanded, stepping fully into the clearing. Austin moved closer, positioning himself between Evelyn and the armed men while addressing Thomas directly. "The debt was never meant to be paid, Thomas. These men have been running this scheme for 20 years, destroying families across the territory. Evelyn was never going to get her sight back. She was going to be murdered to prevent her from exposing their operation." The impact of Austin's words was visible on Thomas's face. The foreman looked at the two ranch hands flanking him, both of whom seemed equally troubled by what they were learning. "Is that why they sent us? To bring her back?" Thomas asked quietly. "Not to protect her, but to deliver her to killers?" Before Austin could answer, movement in the surrounding forest announced the arrival of the other armed men who had been positioned to ensure Evelyn couldn't escape. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their faces hard and their intentions unmistakable. "Enough talking," the lead rider called out. "Thomas, bring us the girl and we'll handle the rest." Austin recognized the voice of one of the gunmen from the ranch. Apparently some had escaped the confrontation with Sheriff Reynolds and followed them to the mountains. The situation had just become much more dangerous. Evelyn clutched her portfolio tighter, and Austin could see her hands trembling as she realized the true scope of the threat against her life. But there was also something else in her expression, a fierce determination that reminded him of the drawings she'd created in secret, proof of her refusal to be completely broken by years of artificial imprisonment. "Thomas," Austin said quietly, "you have a choice to make. You can deliver an innocent woman to men who plan to murder her, or you can help protect someone you've watched grow up from a child." Thomas looked at Evelyn, then at the approaching riders, then back at Austin. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his life. "Miss Evelyn," Thomas said, drawing his gun and turning to face the riders, "get back inside the mission. Whatever happens out here, you stay safe." The two ranch hands followed Thomas's lead, positioning themselves to defend rather than capture. Austin felt a surge of gratitude for these men who had chosen to do right, despite years of being manipulated into serving criminal purposes. "This is touching," the lead rider said with cold amusement, "but ultimately pointless. You're outnumbered, and we have orders to complete regardless of casualties." Austin drew his revolver, feeling the familiar weight of his father's pocket watch against his chest. The final confrontation was about to begin, and everything would depend on whether courage and determination could overcome superior numbers and ruthless tactics. The gunfight erupted with the sudden violence of a mountain thunderstorm. Austin dove behind a fallen log as bullets whined through the air where he'd been standing moments before. Thomas and his men had taken cover behind the mission's stone well, their rifles answering the attackers' fire with deadly precision. But the sound that changed everything was the deep, resonant toll of the mission bell, a bronze artifact that hadn't rung in decades, now pealing across the valley with a clarity that could be heard for miles. Evelyn had somehow reached the bell rope inside the church and was calling for help with a determination that spoke of years of suppressed anger finally finding expression. "Stop that damned bell!" The lead gunman shouted over the continuing gunfire, but his men were pinned down by accurate shooting from Thomas and the ranch hands. Austin used the cover of the bell's tolling to move closer to the mission, knowing that Evelyn's position near the bell made her vulnerable to anyone who managed to breach the church's defenses. His shoulder burned where the earlier bullet had grazed him, but adrenaline kept him moving through the chaos. The bell continued to ring with steady, powerful strokes that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Austin realized that Evelyn wasn't just calling for help, she was making a statement. After 16 years of enforced silence about her true condition, she was announcing her presence to the world with a sound that could not be ignored or suppressed. "Evelyn," Austin called as he reached the church wall. "Stay away from the windows. I can see them, Austin." Her voice replied from inside, filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. "I can see the men with guns, the horses, even the birds in the trees. My sight is coming back." Austin felt his heart leap at her words, but also at the danger they represented. Evelyn's restored vision was making her reckless, drawing her to the windows where she could be targeted by the gunmen outside. The battle shifted when reinforcements arrived, not more criminals, but Sheriff Reynolds and his deputies, guided by the sound of the mission bell across the mountains. The lawmen had apparently won their confrontation at the ranch and followed the trail to the final showdown. "This is Sheriff Reynolds," came the authoritative voice from the tree line. "You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." The lead gunman's response was to fire wildly in the direction of the sheriff's voice while shouting orders to his remaining men. "Kill them all. No witnesses." Austin saw his opportunity as the gunman's attention turned toward the new threat. He sprinted from cover toward the mission door, determined to reach Evelyn before the desperate criminals decided to use her as a hostage. He burst through the church door to find Evelyn standing beneath the bell, her face upturned toward the light streaming through the windows. Tears ran down her cheeks as she experienced the miracle of clear sight for the first time in 16 years. "Austin," she whispered, turning toward him with eyes that truly saw his face. "You're the man who saved my life, aren't you?" "We're not saved yet," Austin replied, taking her hand. "We need to get you somewhere safe while the sheriff deals with the gunman." But Evelyn pulled back, her expression showing a strength that had been forged through years of adversity. "No more hiding, Austin. No more being protected from the truth or kept safe from my own life. If these men want to silence me, they'll have to face me directly." Before Austin could protest, Evelyn walked to the mission door and stepped outside, her portfolio of drawings clutched in her hands like a shield. The gunfight immediately ceased, as everyone, lawmen and criminals alike, stared at the young woman who had emerged from artificial darkness to stand in the full light of day. "My name is Evelyn Brennan," she called out, her voice carrying across the valley with the same clarity as the mission bell. "For 16 years, I've been told I was born blind, but these drawings prove otherwise, and I can see well enough now to identify every face here." The lead gunman raised his rifle toward Evelyn, but Thomas was faster. The foreman's shot knocked the criminal from his horse before he could fire, ending the immediate threat to Evelyn's life. In the sudden silence that followed, Sheriff Reynolds and his deputies emerged from cover to arrest the surviving gunman. The conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives across the territory was finally broken, its leaders dead or captured. Austin watched as Evelyn examined her hands in the sunlight, marveling at the details she could now perceive. The portfolio fell from her fingers, its contents scattering across the ground. Drawings that had been created in secret but now served as public testimony to her courage and resilience. "It's over," Austin said softly, approaching her with the reverence due to someone who had survived an ordeal that would have broken most people. "No," Evelyn replied, turning to face him with eyes that blazed with newfound purpose. "This is where my real life begins." The mission bell gave one final toll, as if blessing the end of Evelyn's long imprisonment and the beginning of her freedom. Around them, the representatives of justice moved to clean up the remnants of a criminal enterprise that had preyed on families across the frontier. But for Austin and Evelyn, the most important victory was the simple fact that they were standing together in the sunlight, two people who had found each other through darkness and emerged into a future bright with possibility. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the old mission church, and Cedar Ridge had settled into a new rhythm that reflected the profound changes brought by the truth's emergence. The autumn light streamed through the windows of what had once been Evelyn's prison-like bedroom, now transformed into an artist's studio, where she spent her mornings capturing the world she was seeing clearly for the first time in 16 years. Austin stood in the doorway, watching as Evelyn applied delicate brushstrokes to a canvas that depicted the view from her window, the same mountains where he had spent 20 years in solitude, now rendered with the loving detail of someone who understood the preciousness of sight. This painting, unlike the secret drawings hidden in darkness, was created in full light and intended to be shared with the world. "The light keeps changing," Evelyn said without looking up from her work. "I never understood how dynamic it could be, the way shadows move, how colors shift throughout the day. Sometimes I feel like I'm trying to capture 23 years of missed sunrises all at once." Austin smiled, recognizing the passionate intensity she brought to everything now that she was free to make her own choices. Her recovery had been remarkable, both physically and emotionally. Dr. Henley's treatments had successfully reversed most of the chemical damage to her optic nerves, and her vision continued to improve each week. "Your father's asking to see you," Austin said gently. "He's waiting in the parlor." Evelyn's brush paused mid-stroke. The relationship with Horace Brennan remained complicated, a mixture of love, forgiveness, and the inevitable distance that came from understanding the full scope of what had been done to her. Horace had been cleared of criminal charges. The evidence showed he'd been as much a victim of the conspiracy as his daughter, but the guilt he carried was punishment enough. "How does he seem today?" Evelyn asked. "Like a man trying to find a grove. Way to live with himself," Austin replied honestly. "The doctors say his health is improving, but losing 20 years of his daughter's trust isn't something that heals quickly." Evelyn set down her brush and turned to face Austin fully. In the months since her sight had returned, she'd grown more beautiful, not because her features had changed, but because the light of genuine happiness now shone from within her. "He saved enough lives in the end," she said quietly. When Sheriff Reynolds broke up the conspiracy, they found evidence of at least 30 families across 4 territories who had children held as collateral. Father's testimony helped free all of them. The scope of the criminal enterprise had shocked even experienced lawmen. The organization had systematically targeted wealthy families in financial distress, offering loans with terms that inevitably led to children being used as human collateral. Some had been temporarily blinded, like Evelyn. Others had been afflicted with mysterious illnesses or disabilities, all reversible in theory, but maintained permanently in practice. "That doesn't erase what happened to you," Austin pointed out. "No, but it gives meaning to what I suffered," Evelyn replied. "If my ordeal helped expose these monsters and save other children, then perhaps there was a purpose to all those years in darkness." Austin marveled at her capacity for forgiveness and her ability to find meaning in trauma. It was a strength that humbled him and made him grateful every day that fate had brought them together. "There's something else," Austin said, reaching into his pocket. "I received a letter from Pete Morrison's lawyer. The final distribution of his estate included something he specifically wanted you to have." He handed her a small wooden box, weathered smooth by years of handling. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a delicate silver locket. "Pete said it belonged to his wife," Austin explained, as Evelyn opened the locket to reveal a tiny painting of wildflowers. "He thought you'd appreciate the artistry, especially since you've discovered your own talent for painting." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears not of sadness, but of gratitude for the kindness of an old man who had recognized her situation and tried to help, even after his death. "He knew, didn't he?" "Oh," she said softly. "Even before you came to town, Pete Morrison suspected something was wrong." "He knew," Austin confirmed, "and he made sure the right evidence reached the right person at the right time. Pete always said that sometimes the most important thing you can do is pay attention to what everyone else is choosing to ignore." They walked together to the parlor, where Horace Brennan waited with the patient resignation of a man who understood that forgiveness was a gift that couldn't be demanded or rushed. He had aged dramatically in the past months, his hair gone completely gray, and his face marked by the weight of guilt and regret. "Evelyn," he said as they entered, rising from his chair with obvious effort, "you look well. The painting is helping. It's helping me see the world as it really is," she replied, the double meaning clear to all of them. "Dr. Henley says my vision will continue to improve for several more months. And after that?" Horace asked hesitantly. "What will you do when you're completely recovered?" Evelyn looked at Austin, her expression showing the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with her past and was ready to embrace her future. "Austin and I are planning to travel," she said. "There's a school in San Francisco that teaches advanced painting techniques. I'd like to study there, learn to capture not just what I see, but what I feel about what I see." "And after San Francisco?" Horace pressed, hope and fear warring in his voice. "We'll come back to Cedar Ridge," Austin said, understanding that Horace needed reassurance that he wouldn't lose his daughter entirely. "This is home, and the town needs good people to help it heal from everything that's happened." The conversation continued for another hour, tentative but genuine efforts toward rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by deception and trauma. When Horace finally departed, Austin and Evelyn stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Are you happy?" Austin asked, though he could see the answer in her face. "I'm free," Evelyn replied, reaching for his hand. "For the first time in my life, I'm making my own choices, seeing the world with my own eyes, and deciding my own future. I never imagined anything could feel this wonderful." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Austin reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd come to Cedar Ridge to settle an old friend's debts, and had ended up saving a life, exposing a conspiracy, and finding a love he'd never thought possible. Evelyn's first painting now hung in the parlor, a landscape of the mountains at sunrise, painted with the skill of someone who understood that every moment of clear sight was a precious gift. It served as a daily reminder that even the darkest circumstances could lead to unexpected beauty, and that sometimes the most important truths were hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look beyond the lies and see what was really there.